So thank you everyone for coming to our 5th online Lunch and Learn session, this London Climate Action Week. This is the big topic we are covering today, which is about adapting to climate change. So just please, if you can make sure that you're on mute so that there's little background noise for the speakers, but we absolutely want this to be an interactive session. So please let us know your questions and comments throughout in the chat. We'll try and get to as many of those as we can in about 5 to 10 minutes of Q&A at the end. And if there's anything we can't get to in time, we will absolutely follow up. And as I say, this is not a one-off event. This is the start of a conversation around this topic, and we hope to be working closely with you on this as time progresses. And we are recording this today, so you'll receive the video and the slides afterwards as well. So a bit of an agenda for today. We've got colleagues from the council talking about why adapt to climate change. And then you'll hear about some of the projects that our teams are working on around green infrastructure and sustainable drainage. You will then hear from David from Groundwork about the Life Plus project, and Vanessa from the Hammersmith Community Gardens Association about community planting for climate adaptation. And finally, a short section from Sasha in our community aid network, reflecting on the pandemic response and kind of talking about community resilience and what can we learn from that. And as I say, we'll finish with an interactive Q&A session as well. But before we get started, I'm very happy to welcome Councillor Wesley Harcourt, Cabinet Member for Environment, who'll say a few words before we get started.
Hi. Hello, everybody. Thanks very much, Emily. It's really good to see so many of you here again. I think it just goes to show how important dealing with climate change is to everybody. You know, today's event about how we can adapt to climate change, I think couldn't really be much more timely. Most of you will have heard over the last couple of days about temperatures reaching 50 degrees Celsius in Canada, over 100 people dying, sadly, related to the heat wave, which is being put down to climate change. I know we spend a lot of our time, a lot of our effort looking on how to mitigate climate change, cutting greenhouse gas emissions, retrofitting properties to make them more energy efficient, renewable energy, but adapting to climate change is something that we've often overlooked. So today, it's important that we look at how we can adapt to climate change, and it's really important that we pay attention when the UK Committee on Climate Change published its latest risk assessment last month, in which it made it clear there's a massive gap between our readiness for climate change and the risks that we're likely to face as a result. For instance, 2018's heat wave saw 864 people dying through heat-related problems and 10,000 subsidence claims from properties. It's estimated that by 2050, beech trees won't be able to tolerate the climate of southern England. That will be a major loss, as beech trees are so typical of the various parts of southern England. Supply chains for food, medicines, other goods are at risk from climate change, such as floods in key supplier countries overseas. Now, you know, global temperatures are continuing to rise, and we can only expect more of the extreme sort of weather events that we witnessed over the last few years, things like heat waves we had last summer, or the ones that saw the fires on Saddleworth Moor in 2018. Torrential rain, flooding, and such like has become much more frequent and part of our weather. Sadly, though, and this is a very important point, climate change adversely affects some of the most vulnerable people in our society. Poorer people usually tend to live in the more dense high-rise housing, prone to extreme heat. Some of the most at risk people from heat waves include older people, disabled people, and those with respiratory conditions or homeless people. So it's going to be crucial that when we tackle this, inequality, when we look at how we adapt to changes in our climate. Luckily, I think many of the solutions will have a beneficial effect on human health and well-being, while at the same time creating a much more pleasant urban environment and benefiting biodiversity. Nature-based solutions such as increasing tree coverage, replacing paving with planting, green roofs and walls are some of the most effective ways of adapting. These can help help to cool buildings, reduce flood risk, and they can offer mental health benefits by giving better or greater access to quality green or open spaces. They give a home for wildlife, help clean the air of pollution, and absorb CO2. Now, let's just be clear, adaptation isn't something limited to large urban schemes. Simple things that we can all do will help make a difference, such as water-saving taps, shower heads, planting rather than paving front or rear gardens, planting a tree, and many other things. But I know we're short of time and I mustn't get carried away. So please enjoy the rest of today's session and I'll hand back to Emily.
Thank you very much, Councillor Harcourt, for that introduction. So to kick us off today, we've got Jim from the Climate Unit answering the question, why adapt to climate change?
Thanks, Emily, and thanks, Councillor Harcourt, for that introduction. Yeah, why adapt to climate change? Well, as Councillor Harcourt has kind of outlined there, a lot of attention gets focused on mitigation, and that is absolutely critical. We need to kind of bring down our greenhouse gas emissions. But we also know that a certain amount of warming is already locked in. Indeed, it's already happened. The world is 1 degree warmer than it was in 1990. So we need to make changes now and make plans so that our people, buildings, infrastructure and environment can cope with the extremes of weather and the kind of long-term changes that we're going to see. And as outlined, the reason we need to do this is for our health, protecting our health, but also tackling the inequalities that exist in the impacts of climate as well. So, you know, we know some of the kind of worst off people live in the kind of buildings that are most prone to climate impacts, for instance, such as in kind of tall high rises or near highways. We also need to avoid the disruption and economic damage that comes from extreme weather events such as flooding, and to prevent further environmental damage as well, including the losses of biodiversity and also the sort of negative feedback loops that we can get from carbon sinks being degraded. So yeah, in terms of our need to adapt, well, so we know that the impacts are global, and we've already kind of heard about the impacts happening right now in Canada, which are incredibly serious. But we're already seeing the effects nationally and even locally as well. And I think this kind of picture to the right illustrates this perfectly. This is a picture of the pedestals of Hammersmith Bridge being cooled after the bridge had to be fully closed last year during the heat wave due to kind of further cracking from the expansion in the steel. Next slide, please, Emily. So what are the risks that we're facing? So extreme heat is one of the most important ones, and perhaps one of the ones that the country is sort of less prepared for than kind of aspects like flooding. So London is expected to be during the summer 2.1 to 4.8 degrees hotter by 2050. That's under the current projections. So you know, if we don't curb emissions, it could be even more challenging than that. And Hammersmith and Fulham is particularly vulnerable to these impacts. So it's heavily influenced by the amount of green space that there is in an area. And Hammersmith and Fulham has a relatively dense building. And we could be seeing heat-related deaths increasing by 500% by 2080, with vulnerable people most at risk. Next slide, please, Em. So flooding is, of course, another very well-known one, and one that H&F is again particularly vulnerable to. So for the time being, we're fairly well protected from the river by the Thames Barrier. That will have to be upgraded during this century. So you know, climate mitigation is absolutely key to kind of stopping further sea level rises. But actually, one of the kind of most imminent risks to us from flooding is surface water flooding. Most of the borough, about 2/3 of it from Shepherd's Bush down to South Fulham, is under 5 meters above sea level, and the sewers have very limited drainage capacity. So again, similar to extreme heat, hard surfacing is one of the really key factors in here. Hard surfacing massively increases the risk of flooding by means that the water, rather than soaking into the soil, drains into our sewers, which rapidly become overrun and lead to surface water flooding. It's a great risk to to property, life, also very well documented impacts on mental health that people who've suffered flooding can have for many years afterwards. Water supply or drought, I think, is a really sort of understood risk to London. So about 25% of London's water sources are considered high risk. And with London's increasingly growing population, the projection, if no action is taken, is for a shortfall of 400 million litres of water against what we'll need by 2040. And this is one of these areas that can have a huge impact when it happens, cost to 330 million pounds to London per day during a drought, and effects on health, but also sort of business, economic life. Next slide, please, Emily. And then finally, related to all of these risks are other impacts from these risks that happen at a national and global level. So we could see weakened supply chains from droughts, flooding in other countries, for instance. New diseases and pests, and I think, you know, a lot has been spoken about sort of COVID and the possible links with how humanity is encroaching on nature, which increases the risk of new diseases, as well as our changing climate, which creates a more sort of viable habitat for certain diseases. And among other areas, crop failure as well in the presence of drought, biodiversity loss, power outages, as we're seeing in Canada at the moment from the heat wave, as well as negative feedback effects, damage to carbon sinks like peatlands, which will then release more carbon, increasing the effects of climate change and leading to this sort of negative cycle. So what can we do about this in brief? So a key part is to understand the risks, to understand what the impacts are going to be, where they're going to be centred, who's most vulnerable in those areas, and what kind of services we can expect to be affected. This map on the right shows recordings of heat over the last 4 years in London, specifically in Hammersmith and Fulham. And shows the variation in temperature between different parts of the borough. If you can sort of interpret this in only a few seconds, what it's showing you, these really light spots, so particularly in South Fulham, for instance, are where we see much higher temperatures, actually about 10 degrees higher than other parts of the borough. And it maps almost perfectly to areas with the least green space. Next slide, please, Emily. So one of the best things we can do is go green for that very reason. It protects against heat, it protects against flooding. And these are things that, as Councillor Harcourt mentioned, we can actually all do a little and have a huge cumulative effect in this space. It's not just about large projects. So, you know, anyone who can could plant a tree, could replace hard surfacing with some planting. And also really important, choose drought tolerant plants as well. Think about how these plants are going to be able to survive into the future. And I think Vanessa from Hammersmith Community Gardens is also going to talk a bit about that in a little while, so I won't dwell on that. Next slide, please, Emily. So this is just an example of what someone has done with their driveway. So taken up 2 lines of paving slabs, replaced one with permeable paving so that cars can still park in front of it, and then planted on another, which will also allow the water to kind of drain into it and provides a space for wildlife too. Next slide, please, Emily. So the other important thing that we have to do is to modify our buildings to make them cooler and to reduce water use. And again, there are some simple things that we can do in this, and the cumulative impact is great. So water saving measures such as changing our shower heads to low flow shower heads or low flush toilets. We can also disconnect our drain pipes either via some planting or via water butts. But also we want to cool our homes sustainably as well, avoid the air conditioning if possible. And simple measures like shutters, shades and blinds can do that. The image on the top shows someone that is obviously not in this country, a much hotter country at the moment, at least. But white roofs, which are common in hot countries, can massively reduce the urban heat island effect we experience. Very cheap to install as well. And finally, and really importantly, it's about building strong networks and making the plans that we need to make for these kind of extreme weather events. So we have to plan ahead for these climate risks, and the council has a strong role in that. We have heatwave plans. I think these will need to be reviewed to encompass the kind of greater risks that we're going to see over the coming decades. But it's also about community resilience as well. Who do you know who is potentially vulnerable, who falls into categories like disabilities, respiratory illnesses, older people, or the very young? And are they sort of living in the kind of conditions that could be impacted by this? There's also an absolute need for coordination across London. Some of these risks are impossible for one borough or one community to deal with alone. Things like supply chain impact the whole of the UK. So at all levels, both from the kind of individual, community, local and the national, we need to be building these networks and plans for the future.
Fab, thank you, Jim. There's so much food for thought there and so much content there. So no doubt there'll be a lot of questions for us to follow up at the end. So now I'd like to introduce Ian from H&F Environmental Projects and Highways to do a brief talk about green infrastructure and sustainable urban drainage systems.
So I hope this works and you can see me.
Yes, we can hear and see you.
Can see me. Excellent. Okay. So I did warn Jim, I could probably talk for more than 5 minutes about this. It's been a bit of a journey for Highways because I can talk about 40 plus greening and flood schemes that we've done. And you can see them now. You go to Peterborough Road, or you go to, the picture is about Australia Road, which was the first flagship flood risk greening scheme we did. We proved it was possible because before that we talked a lot about what we would do in terms of flood risk and how we would do that. But Australia Road was the real challenge of whether we could actually do that in a public realm scheme. I think it's really important. What people miss in terms of highways and public realm is not what's above, but below. Because what sits below our surfaces is a spaghetti junction of pipes for water, for gas. There's electric cables, there's telecommunications, and there's all the kind of stuff that we've got in terms of our rain gullies and sewers as well. And managing that is a really difficult problem when you're trying to put green infrastructure. So over the last few years, we have adapted and changed and done some really interesting work around how we got trees into the ground that would survive because they're fighting for this space underneath. So we found something called a root management system. It's quite clever in the fact that it allows you to dig a pit which will contain water, and then but also allows you to have air in the soil. And the one thing that trees need in soil is air. And we as engineers love to compact it. So there's a bit of a challenge there. We like compacted surfaces, and underneath we really like compacted soil, but the tree doesn't like that. So what we've tried in terms of root management system allows us to have that compaction, but allows the soil to have air in it. And we've done this in, I've lost track of how many schemes we've done this. And we've used this system, which means we can plant more trees. So we've done some work in Galloway and Overston and Seagrave, where we've virtually tripled the amount of trees we can put in the ground, and they survive and they flourish. And one thing I will say is it's not always about the infrastructure. It is about the people and the community that we have to engage. We've had somewhere in the region of about £8 million from Thames Water to do some retrofit flood risk schemes. Mandora, Molina, and there's a whole list of roads that we've done. The most important thing was that we learned lessons as we went along. So one size doesn't fit all. So one thing that will work in one place won't work in another place. So we've learned as we've go along. But there's a nice story about Mendora. So Mendora Road was a road that we completely changed the road. So we dug up the road, we retrofitted some flood risk measures, different ones on either side, and we used a asphalt that's actually permeable, so it allows water through. So it's a hard surface, but it allows water through. And I think the story that changed my mind about how we engage with the public was we were virtually close to finishing the programme, and we'd laid this asphalt surface. And unfortunately, the dust cart came along and they put the bag in, but they didn't know that there was white paint in the bag, and it leaked. And this nice shiny new surface, which was permeable, suddenly had a whole heap of white paint. Now, that's not the story. The story is that we get a call in the morning around about 7:30 and say, "Oh, look, this new surface has just been covered with paint. Can you help us?" And when we arrive on site, there's a group of residents with sponges and buckets trying to clean the surface. That means we got the message through why this was important. They understood why we were doing the works, and they actually understood why we had to disrupt their lives, because it was a 4 months programme to completely dig out the carriageway and put this new flood risk measures in. So I would emphasise it's not just the infrastructure, but it's getting people to buy into what we're doing. And sometimes this is disruptive and it causes a bit of chaos in their lives. We found that people are positive when we talk about the message and why we're doing things. At the moment we're doing other schemes. So we've got a whole host of schemes at the moment. One is Healthy School Streets, where we're looking at the roads around schools where we can put green infrastructure, more flood risk measures. But I think equally the most important story is flood risk and greening in highways is not special. It's what we do. And any engineer now that does a project, flood risk and greening is part of that conversation. Before then, it was about how we could put shiny new ASP down, or some York stone that looks really lovely when it's laid. We've moved away from that to ask the question about greening infrastructure. And that's part of the conversation right at the beginning of the design. And that's the massive change. That's a change from where we were to where we are now. And that conversation with the public and residents about why we're doing schemes. So the other thing we've got is our highways maintenance programme isn't just about replacing what's there. So we do a whole scheme around where we can put more tree pits. And so that green infrastructure, that flood risk is now embedded in everything that we do. And it's quite nice that when you look at other boroughs like Enfield or Kingston and Merton, they're copying what we're doing. So I think that copying is quite flattering for us. But equally we're learning some of the stuff that they've done.
I might ask if you can wrap up, and then so we can get onto some questions at the end.
That's it. I'm now completely finished. I told you I could talk for a long time.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think if you're able to stay on to the end and join us for the Q&A, it'd be great to hear some more questions about that. So thank you very much for that, Ian. And so we've now got 3 lightning talks. First of all, from David from Groundwork, who will talk about the Life Plus project.
Hello, can you hear me okay? Lovely, thumbs up, very good. Hi everyone, it's very nice to meet you. Just a very quick introduction to Groundwork, who we are, what we do. We are an environmental and social charity. It's really great to have been invited to come and talk to you as part of Climate Action Week. This fits so closely with our core message and the type of work that we're looking to deliver at the moment, and also this increasing switch towards far more responsive and climate adaptive landscapes that we've been working on for several years now. Some of you may know us. We've been working in Hammersmith Fulham for a long time as part of the HIP programme for many years, which is slowly starting to wrap up. But what we wanted to talk to you about today was a couple of projects, one of which is Life Plus, as is mentioned, and very briefly another project called Nourish. But it'll be a bit of a whistle-stop tour. As you say, it's a lightning talk, a very brief overview. And what we want to do is just to show you some examples of different types of SUDs really. There's a really strong emphasis on that, on suds and adaptability in the urban landscape. Hopefully try and inspire some of you to some projects of your own, and just to give you a bit of an idea as to what's possible, really, and to see some of these in action. Because as other people have said, it's not always about large projects, even though these are on quite a big scale. It's quite easy to see some of these being taken to smaller scales and being delivered at different levels, and that cumulative impact is really important. So a quick intro to the project. What we'd set out to do was to demonstrate that a landscape-led approach to urban retrofit using very lightly engineered nature-based solutions can be used to achieve just this whole range of positive outcomes for people and for place, and can really greatly contribute to the reduction in climate change impacts. They're highly replicable. We'll show some photos in a moment. It's great to hear Ian talking about other people copying what his team have been doing. There's a really strong vein in Hammersmith and Fulham in putting in this climate adaptation, and I'd say that as a project partner and project sponsor, and we do lots of work with them. So it's really good what you guys are doing in the borough. But what we're looking to show you is how to retrofit. This idea of retrofitting in a highly urbanised environment, lots of the topics that Jim already covered. We are seeing an increase in population density. We're seeing loss of biodiversity through reductions in budget, sometimes for maintenance, and also space that's available to those sorts of things in green space. We're seeing increases in the urban heat island effect, more severe flooding events, as already been discussed in Canada, less predictable weather. And we're also seeing increased social isolation in some instances, and the importance and value of our green spaces is becoming ever more pertinent, especially now when what people have been through with the pandemic. And also this idea that we're perhaps lacking in connection with nature. So we've set out to try to really address some of these issues throughout the project. What we've taken is a landscape-led approach. So I wanted to say a little bit about what that was. That's taking an idea that's a slight counterpoint to traditional drainage systems. So if you think of how, perhaps not in Hammersmith and Fulham with all the instances that Ian's just given, but water is traditionally treated as being something that's a bit of a problem, and needs to be taken away from flooding zones as fast as possible to keep roads clear and reduce flooding. But this idea of it being a landscape-led approach treats water as a resource and something that's really valuable. How can we use it to create better places, and how can we use it as an inspiring point to drive through design? So this image that you can see is on Queen Caroline Estate, and it's just what was a piece of amenity green space. And you can see all of the extra things that this space is doing. You can see it's a much more pleasant environment for people to play in, to access. It's doing a lot more than just a normal piece of amenity green space. There's higher levels of biodiversity. This idea of naturalism and nature, and creating spaces that perhaps encourage people to have more interaction with those sorts of things. And also this idea behind something being landscape-led, a really important part of that is the community focus, the community-led element of what we do in our projects, and also helping us in adopting some parts of those schemes, supporting us in how those projects have been delivered as well. Thank you very much. This is an example of a basin. So this is a fairly typical suds element. So I think this is a really interesting picture. It just kind of challenges us to rethink what is our approach to how we design. If you think of either a typical housing estate or even a typical piece of landscape design, what is that actually doing? And actually everything that you can see in this image is working really hard. So it is obviously great for placemaking. It's a very welcoming access point with a new bridge on a really well-used pedestrian route to get people through the estate. It's got really high levels for amenity. It looks great. Kids come and play on this bridge, sort of hide and do, trolls hiding under the bridge and so on. So it's a really interesting play feature. Biodiversity is really high. This is also doing something called attenuating flows, attenuating water. So this is a basin which sits at the end of a series of different suds devices. So you can see the housing in the background. All of the rainwater that lands up on those roofs is captured in those downpipes. and runs through a series of swales and basins that run through a landscape which is planted up with wildflowers and some play elements, and then those discharge into this, which is at the end of the run. So the rainwater is captured all the way through that system and is used as a kind of creative force and a creative element behind the way that the landscape's been designed. So it's holding back quite a lot of water. Well, I'll show you at the end with some results, but very high amounts of water, and reducing flood risk.
Could I potentially ask that we do another 2 minutes so that we can have time for questions at the end?
Yeah, sure. About 2 minutes. Okay, right. We'll whistle through them then. So these are types of sods. So this is a living roof. So just as an example, it's really great for placemaking as well. Good for source control. So when water lands on them, not very much water gets back into the network. They're great for thermal performance, as Ian and Jim have also both mentioned, and really important in spaces where you can look down on the landscape as well. Next slide. So these are bioswales and rain gardens. So the reason that we dropped this slide in was just to give you an idea of what, in a very simple way, fairly normal bits of amenity space could be and how they could function. So you can see on the right-hand image that the roofs are redirecting all of their water down through some adapted gullies with flow control monitors down at the bottom into a bioretention swale. And again, the middle image is taking rainwater from the roof and from the footpath, and is doing a lot for biodiversity there too. Next slide would be great. So this is an idea of multifunctionality in space. So throughout Queen Caroline Estate, there are these different pockets of open space. You can see here there's some food growing. There's some espalier trees off to the right-hand side. The TRA there is wonderful, it's great. They are still using those as food growing spaces several years on. A swale running through the middle and just a connecting deck. But you can see that there's this idea of multifunctionality and using rainwater as a creative element within the design process. Next slide. Here's a few of the results, but given that I think we've got about 30 seconds left, I might skip over those. We might well come back to them. So there's, yeah, just very quickly, another project called Nourish, which I just wanted to show because it's live and being finished off at the moment. It's actually very close to Australia Road. It wraps up Australia Road, the image that Ian showed. All of the stormwater from all of the roofs on the estate, which is at a very big scale, 15,000 square meters, is actually being redirected through rain gardens and swales and basins through all of the green spaces on there. There's also some really good flow through planters up towards the top of the site. So if you could possibly flick on one more, there's a few photos. We've used really, really simple methods to try to achieve that. So we're redirecting flows from downpipes again through different granite set channels and above ground sets, running through a series of swales and basins. As you can see on the top left-hand image there, that's just a Gabion retaining wall, which helps to act as a check dam as well. But those spaces are all infiltrating water. They are all absorbing water, and they're really adding a lot towards the flood risk reduction there. And that's all of them. So that's a very whistle-stop tour of lots of photos. Yeah, sorry to rattle through that quite so quickly. There's my contact details there, and a colleague of mine, Daniel Brittle, who is our community engagement officer. So please do get in contact with us if you'd like to talk about any projects. But yeah, fire some questions at me towards the end.
Thank you so much, Dave, and sorry to rush you there.
That's
an absolutely brilliant whistle-stop tour. So thank you for going through those, some beautiful photos there. So we have 2 more talks before we get on to Q&A. So next, I'm going to introduce Vanessa from Hammersmith Community Gardens. So over to you, Vanessa, for your lightning talk.
Hi. Next slide, please. Hi, yeah. My name's Vanessa. I basically work for Hammersmith Community Gardens most of the time, but I also work for Hammersmith Academy as well as the Sustainability Environment Lead there. And I do a lot of stuff out in the community all the time. So I'm out gardening every day. So I'm actually talking to you from a very practical application, because I'm out there working in the community gardens of Godolphin, Loris, Australia Road, a lot of the studs gardens and so forth. We also do community sites, youth clubs, schools, housing estates in the local area. So I'm working on a basis of this is a very practical horticultural sort of look at what's going on locally. Next slide, please. So the issues we're facing. So I'm talking about this from what I'm actually experiencing, not from facts, figures or anything like that. We've seen all that, but I'm telling you, when we're out there, it is a lot hotter and drier every summer when we're working. The ground is harder and we're seeing a lot less absorption of water in the ground. But when it does rain, oh my goodness, the ground is getting very, very soggy. We're also noticing very, very high winds in the summer. Hammersmith Academy can be working in a wind tunnel sometimes, the wind. So the impact that's having on sort of full grown plants in the summer is also, particularly trees, are really struggling with some of the things that are taking place. Next slide, please. So how are we actually sort of looking at what we're actually doing with the gardens in Hammersmith Community Gardens and in Hammersmith Academy is the key one is that it's really important when you're selecting the plants. It's got to be the right plant for the right place. That is probably the 101 for any gardener, is doing that one. But I'm going to talk a little bit more about what you can be doing to do that. When we're selecting our plants, we're also selecting ones that are what we call probably mid-sized plants. And we're only going for ones that are in the 2 to 5 litre category, because if we select ones that are reasonably young and vigorous, they can get their roots down and they're not using masses of water constantly, just trying to get their initial growth in. So it's very important that we're not choosing massively large plants to plant, because obviously if you've seen how the council has to plant trees, they have to put the tree pipes down and be giving them large amounts of water to get them to establish. So we avoid doing that. Timing, any planting in autumn or early spring is the best time to do it, because it's putting a lot less stress on any plant to do it then. But one of the key things we look at doing is mulching. So that picture there is of Australia Road that was recently heavily mulched. We put 15-ton bags of mulch on there alone, and it has a massive impact because the mulch we choose is always a wood chip based one. So that it actually biodegrades down into the soil, and all of that organic matter biodegrades down into the soil and becomes much more water retentive. So therefore it's increasing the health of the plant because it has some nutrition and so forth, also holds that water in. The mulch also keeps the weeds down, because weeds compete with the plants that you want to keep for water availability. So it's really important that we try and have that whole massive sort of make sure the weeds is down, make sure it's mulched. So if we're talking about the right plant for the right place, we're looking at ones for dry conditions. So the 3 categories are desiccation tolerant, the cactus. We're not interested in them. Drought avoidance plants are really useful for us. They're the ones that have built up water supplies. Or drought tolerant plants. They're the ones that show characteristics of the sorts of plants that we want to have. Next slide, please. So these are the key ones. For those of you who are not horticulturalists, I thought it might be worthwhile us actually putting this in here of what you are looking at if you're going to go and buy your plants or select the plants for drought tolerance. So anything with a grey leaf reflects the light back, so it helps keep the leaf cool. Furry leaves are designed to sort of capture water within the leaf itself. They also shade the stomata on the leaf so that, again, it doesn't lose water as quickly. Anything very thin-leaved, if you look at all the Mediterranean plants, the things that we love, sort of the lavenders, the rosemaries and so forth, have very thin leaves. Also conifers do, because conifers have to cope with quite sort of extreme conditions. So they have developed thin leaves to avoid that water loss. Anything with a thickened leaf or a root that stores water, so succulents, the one that's in the top left-hand corner there is that's Sebum spectable. That's quite a really great one for the garden because it's beloved by bees. The leaves are actually very thick. If you break them, you can actually see the water coming out. Anything like the holly with the a thick cuticle, that top coat of the leaf, again, that reflects light back and it helps keep the leaf, even when it desiccates, it doesn't actually sort of completely dry down. So it's a really useful one. Shedding leaves, any deciduous tree usually is more drought tolerant than not. Also, a lot of evergreens will shed leaves as soon as it starts getting hot. So you might find, like my pittosporum in my front garden, shed masses of leaves when it got really hot a couple of weeks ago, just to get rid of excess, but it survived. So it's a useful one. Next slide, please.
Vanessa, can I also ask if we wrap up in the next 2 minutes?
Thank you.
Thanks.
So the things that are working really well in this local area, the ornamental grasses grow really well. Spring bulbs, because the way this system works with drier summers, they like to be dry while it's dormant, and they come up in the spring. So spring bulbs are a super one. The birches in Bridget Joyce Square are doing brilliantly. Some of these other ones, the perennials, Nyphophia, hardy geranium, Sisyrinchium, Ignis, dog roses, they're all doing brilliantly in this local area. My favourite is Nepeta, which is catmint, because it has thrived in every single bed we've put it in. It is really drought tolerant. The bees adore it. It smells good, and it has the ability to suppress weeds without using any chemicals. So it creates a mat outside it. All the weeds are suppressed. It's great. And I would encourage people to be looking at things really creatively. In Walpole Park in Ealing, they've recently sort of put in, a couple of years ago, but they put in Rosa Banksia, which is a huge climbing rose, but they've cut them into shrubs. And my goodness, they are so drought tolerant, they're shade tolerant, they're sun tolerant, and they have been making huge impact there. Next slide, please. These are just some that I've taken from the local area. These are ones that I took last summer, or I took a couple of them only a few days ago. Things that are doing really well. These are suds beds, all of them, and you can see the Nepetas doing well. So these are, you know, if you get the right plant, they will do really well. Next slide, please. Thought I'd just mention some of the problems we're facing. Though. Ornamental grasses look good, but they have a massive fire risk. When they are dry in the winter and into the early spring, unfortunately, there are people who decide to set them alight. So it limits the biodiversity benefit that you get from them, because the main biodiversity benefit from an ornamental grass is that they die down and become habitat. We can never leave them to die down, ever, because we've seen too many fires so far, particularly on Bridget Joyce Square. This one that sort of to take on with Ian, that sometimes the soil that's put into the suds beds, because you need something with a very high drainage in there, it's not very good for water retention. So we struggled during the drought time with some of the sort of composts that are delivered. The drainage, the damage to the plants from people walking on them, driving on them. Yes, people do drive across flower beds quite frequently. And we get people who use them to dump their waste on. Vandalism, the picture there was last spring, somebody decided to just take off every single daffodil. They didn't even want to take them away, they just broke them off and threw them on the ground. Ground cover plants, which should be a 101 for us to keep the soil moist and keep the weeds down, because people walk all over the public beds, very difficult to keep it going. We would estimate that we probably lose on average about 25% of every public community planting we do, with people walking on the plants, driving on them and so forth. We don't think enough is taken into account for long-term maintenance plans when people are planning community planting. And I would agree with Ian about that, talking with residents, because we talk with residents every single time we're out working on there. The number of people who come up and ask us about the suds beds, about what's happening in Bridget Joyce Square, we talk to them, we explain to them, and so many people say to us they didn't really understand what was taking place. The signs are wonderful, but people want to talk, and that's where, because we're on the ground and we're with people all the time, people like to talk to us about what the gardens are doing. Next slide.
Vanessa, do you mind if we do this as a lightning slide and wrap up?
Okay,
in a sec?
Just the ones that we're doing really well, we're learning as well every time we do it. Huge levels of community involvement, particularly since COVID. Bridget Joyce Square, people keep saying to us how much they appreciate it. We've got lots and lots of community activities going on in Bridget Joyce Square. It's great for all sorts of things. And I'd like to sort of do a call out for some of our unsung heroes, because people like Anthony, Tony and Robert, you won't know who they are, but they are there every single day watching those beds. They feed back to us because we're there locally. They tell us when anything goes wrong. So those are amazing people who are doing things that you don't even know that they're doing to keep them clean. Robert is out there every day picking up litter in every bed around the local area. So yeah, I'd like to sort of do a call out for them. And lastly, if any of you are interested, we do professional tours. The next one is on the 21st of July, and you will meet lots of people who've got like-minded ideas about how to keep the local area looking good. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. Again, so much to cover there and absolutely brilliant work. So thank you so much. It's so inspiring to hear about that. Our final talk, and Sasha, I'll ask if you can keep this to 5 minutes so that we've got 10 minutes for questions, is from Sasha, a colleague working from the Community Aid Network, who will tell us a bit about that. And I think it opens up a really interesting conversation about what we can learn from the pandemic response in terms of community resilience for climate change. Over to you, Sasha.
Thanks, Emily. Can you see me?
Yes, perfect.
Right. I'll keep it very short. So H&F CAN, the Hammersmith Fulham Community Aid Network, was launched in March 2020 in response to the pandemic. When the pandemic kicked off, and even before the national lockdowns were announced, H&F launched a Community Aid Network to support our vulnerable and shielding residents in the borough. Early days, we provided support in purchasing food, doing shopping requests, loneliness and isolation, mental health, domestic abuse and addiction. Mentioned Conversation Matters there, that is our befriending service. For those that were shielded and weren't able to go out, a volunteer would contact them and talk to them over the phone just to keep them mentally active and provide them a bit of company. That's what the Conversation Matters was. Next slide, please. So the way the team was established was groups across the council were put together, teams put together, and contact centre staff were advertised for and recruited. Council also opened a page on our website requesting volunteers for local residents to come forward, which they did. It says in the next slide, but some 1,000 residents actually come forward to volunteer for the H&F CAN network, CAN service. It's kind of dwindled down to 123 because obviously circumstances changed. Some of them were affected by the pandemic, and but we still do have to this day 123 active volunteers. And just to put it in a bit of context there, between March 2020 and 2021, the service received some 13,000 plus support requests from our residents, and obviously that peaked during the national lockdowns, the second and third lockdowns, and yeah, so the next slide, please. So I mentioned our volunteer service. As mentioned before, some 1,000 signed up at the beginning when CAN was launched in March last year, and they are requested to support in a variety of roles, which are queue management at our vaccination and testing sites, as well as doing shopping, dog walking, pharmacy pickups, and helping at the local food bank. And that is packing up the food in the food bank and delivering it to our vulnerable residents that couldn't go out. We also work with local organisations, including our mutual aid groups. There are approximately 9 of those covering the wards in Hammersmith and Fulham. They have their volunteers as well, which we tap into, and vice versa. So if they have a request in their ward, we will cover it. If they can't cover it, we would. And if we need their help, they would step into. Also, we work with the food banks and some local charities as well. Like I said, our volunteers, we've got 123 on our books at the moment, and they support in the requests that are on the screen, and also any ad hoc ones that come through. One is that they're supported on recently was our Meals on Wheels service, which is just over the last couple of days. But sorry, in closing, it's just how the residents of the borough came together and supported our service, and still are to this day. We still got residents signing up to be volunteers, and our service is very much in need and still quite busy, where we are still assisting those during the pandemic. And that's it. Shorter than 5 minutes.
Thank you, Sasha. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, again, I think there's so much that we can learn about how the council and community work together, you know, in a common goal. So thank you for sharing your reflections on the pandemic response. So we now have 10 minutes for Q&A. So I'll hand over to Simone to read out some of the questions and give them out to some of our speakers.
Thanks, Emily. We've had a lot of kind comments thanking our speakers for their inspiring talks, but I'll try to focus on the comments and questions that are looking for an answer since we only have so long. So first of all, reducing the need to own a private car through improved low-carbon public transport systems would massively increase the opportunity to provide protection against rainwater flash flooding. We must turn the land given to car parking into soft landscaping and urban drainage, with co-benefits of providing space for biodiversity, reducing carbon emissions, and reducing the cost of travel. Win-win-win. And we had a few comments after that agreeing and suggesting other things. So Jim kindly showed us earlier what you can do to your private driveway if you have one, which still leaves room for you to park your car if you're not ready to make the switch. But can I now invite a colleague to comment on this in terms of more public parking spots?
Ian, is this something that I can probably speak to this a bit, but is this something you can speak to from your highways experience at all? The soft landscape?
I'll just speak rather than put the camera on. It is something that we are looking at. Obviously, parking needs hard space, so there are lots of alternatives out there about how you use that particular surface. And so it is an area that we looked at, and actually it's an area we're doing now. So parking spaces on the side of roads, for example, where we're using a mixture of chemical materials, how we deal with that completely. You're right, we are looking at how we change the dynamics in terms of transport. So EV charges, for example. So we're doing 1,000+ charging points, and we want to do more. By the end of the year, we would have 1,000 charging points. Our contractors are also looking about how they use electric vehicles as well. So changing the mode of travel, changing how we use our streets is something that highways, parking and transport policy are looking at the moment. So it's quite a conversation that we're already having. Of course, it's the difficult one. So you've got to convince people that they can move away from the old-fashioned vehicle to a different alternative, whether that be an electric vehicle or whether they move to cycling, or even good old-fashioned walking, which is all good as well. So we've got plans to look at our footways and improve those as well. So we're looking across the piece in terms of how we change the public realm. Does that answer the question?
I think so, thank you. We can move on to the next one. Does the council have a target of planting more trees on our streets?
Oh, is that me again?
I think it might be.
Okay, yes, we do. So one of the reasons we started looking at this tree root management system was around how we got trees to survive. It's not just about planting trees. We can plant trees anywhere in the borough. The trick is to get those trees to not only survive, but to thrive in its environment. So the plan is we've got a tree planting programme we're just working on at the moment, which should increase the number of trees in the borough. We're looking about the infrastructure as well. So it's in the highways maintenance programme, we have an entire section that when we do footways that we look for trees planting spots as well. So the plan is, yes, we are going to increase the amount of trees, but not just trees. It's about green infrastructure as well. People get quite focused in on trees. I know we're quite passionate about trees, but it's a mixture of both. So the answer is yes, that's what we're doing, and we've now got the tools to be able to do that, and that's the important thing. Now, we can plant lots of trees, but if they die in 6 months, that's not the great way of going forward. So we've got a route now where we can actually get trees into the ground with this. With what's underneath it is so challenging, but now we can do that. That's a scheme. So we've already done schemes in Galloway, Overston, Seagrave. We're doing North End Road, starting North End Road at the moment. We're planting more trees in virtually every project that we're doing. So it's a long-winded answer to yes, I suppose. There you go.
Thank you. Our next question is Ealing Town Centre. Lots of New York stone paving being installed, but not so green. I'm not sure if this is in the borough of Ealing. I might be wrong. But if it is in Ealing, I'm afraid we don't have power over that since we're Hammersmith and Fulham. If anyone would like to correct me if I'm wrong.
I'm guessing it is in Ealing Town Centre. We don't have one of those. Look, the challenge in terms of highways is a difficult one, right? So I'm kind of unique in that I get this. Highways, people in highways, for a long time, our goal was putting as much Yorkstone and ASP shiny stuff in as possible. That's a challenge that we have in highways, and that industry is challenging that. And there's a sea change in how we've moved away from that. There will still be schemes that you will see that. It's a challenge for me to challenge colleagues in Ealing that that's not the right way to go. But there's been some amazing work across not just London, but in Sheffield and across the country about greening the grey, which gives the same kind of outcome, but use planting and green infrastructure to do that. And there's some brilliant examples out there, examples that we want to showcase. And the best way to challenge that is to show Ealing exactly what we can do, and when we give them the chance.
Simone, should we do one or two more questions and then wrap up?
Yes, so since we don't have too much time, I won't read out this question full, just the end part, which is the question. Does the council have a clear plan of what we've learnt through these trials and can thus apply to the whole borough? So these are plans with the SUDS, I'm guessing, and all our other little bits and bobs.
So yeah, I mean, Ian might say something about the kind of plans for SUDS, but yeah, I think it's a really fair question, and you know, it is about kind of looking at the whole borough and kind of thinking about those risks overall. So I think one thing that that we're doing now, and as Ian mentioned, they've been doing that in highways projects for some time, but is we're looking at all of our building and refurbishment projects from the lens of how does this adapt for climate change as well as mitigating climate change. So we'll be retrofitting our council housing stock and our corporate buildings as well over the coming decade. So as well as kind of looking at how we can get these buildings to net zero, it will also be looking at where can we kind of green the grey, where can we include those adaptive measures, and also make sure that that you know the retrofitting itself is of a high quality and doesn't increase the sort of heat risk that residents are exposed to as well. And if done right, it can reduce that risk. So part of it is about mainstreaming adaptation into all of the other infrastructural projects that we do, and as I kind of mentioned earlier, cumulatively that will have an incredible effect overall. And then the other side is about kind of understanding the risk. So we don't have a kind of full adaptive plan at the moment, but we're beginning to see some examples of that, quite early examples at the local level from some other areas that I think will be really good to learn from. So City of London, for instance, has conducted, I think, at fairly considerable expense, but a sort of climate adaptive pathways plan, which provides a really kind of useful template for this. And that map I showed you earlier is from a series of climate vulnerability maps produced by Bloomberg and Greater London Authority. And those are available online through the GLA data store, so I recommend looking at those. But that gives us a really strong evidence base to start with about saying where are the kind of risks, where are the impacts in terms of kind of heat risk, in terms of flooding risk, but also where are our most vulnerable people located in relation to that, and how does that map against our sort of access to green space or tree canopy. So we are building that evidence base, and that will form part of the wider plan. So this is a plan for adaptation. So I think it is worth saying that you know, that this is equally important, but it's something that needs to be kind of rolled out as kind of part of all of our sort of infrastructural works. We need to mitigate immediately, and we need to adapt intelligently. But there's much that we've already been doing and that we will continue to do. So yeah. Anyway, thanks for your question.
Thanks, Jim. I think I need to wrap us up there because I'm conscious of time. But please, I know we haven't got to all the questions, but we will follow up with those Q&As by email, and my door is always open. I would absolutely love to pick up the conversation with anyone on any topics we've covered today or this week. And this is the start of a conversation and a whole program of work that we're doing to tackle the climate and ecological emergency. So I'm so grateful to all of our speakers today for sharing the work that they're doing and much more the work we have to come. And I hope that we can do that in partnership with everyone on the call here. Final three things: we've launched a community map of all the brilliant projects that are happening locally to address the climate and ecological emergency. This is on the recommendation of our brilliant resident-led commission. So we'll share the link, have a look, tell us what's missing. We want to build up a picture of all the great things that are happening across the borough. Please also sign up for our newsletter. This is a new monthly newsletter where we're talking about what the council's doing, sharing community stories and opportunities to get involved. And we have an extra bonus event next Tuesday, run by our climate education team, who will be talking about all the work that's happening to bring climate change into schools in Hammersmith and Fulham. So please do join us next Tuesday for an extra Climate Action Week event. But other than that, thank you very much for coming along today and for coming along the whole week. We hope to continue the conversation and hope everyone, hope to see you all soon. Thank you very much.